Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Talking Books. It's traditional around the time of landmark dates with the U.S. Constitution. We have a kind of civic religion in this country that treats as real folk heroes the founding fathers and treats as miraculous the achievement of the U.S. Constitution, even if it was something that needed tweaking or revision around the Civil War. We are really pleased to be joined today by someone who disagrees with that premise. Elie Mystal is the Nation's justice correspondent. He's an Alfred Nobler Fellow at the Type Media Center. He is the legal editor of the More Perfect podcast on the Supreme Court for Radiolab, a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, a former associate at Debevoise and Plimpton, and a frequent guest on MSNBC and Sirius XM. This, Allow Me To Retort, a black guy's guide to the U.S. Constitution, is his first book and one that is making is gathering quite a lot of attention. So we're really pleased to have the opportunity to welcome him. Elie, thanks for being here on Talking Books.
Thank you so much for having me, Harry. I'm one of the few people, I think, who will still invite me over for 4th of July celebrations, just at the moment.
Well, you know, it's funny. Actually, I wasn't going to start here, but let me start with an anecdote. I clerked for Thurgood Marshall in 1987, and that was the bicentennial of the Constitution, and he wanted to give a talk, and he did. But just as you begin your book saying, our Constitution is not good, which is a pretty good indication of where we're going, Marshall, in a pretty well-known essay at the occasion of the bicentennial said, look, I don't believe that, I don't find the wisdom, foresight, and sense of justice exhibited by the framers particularly profound. To the contrary, the government they devised was defective. So, you know, it's a rare sentiment, but he, I think like you, was an institutionalist who held it. Let's just start at the founding and the defects, the sort of, structural defects at the inception, both, I guess, in the personal morality of the founders, but in the actual text. What do you see as, if we just freeze 1789 or whatever, look at the Constitution at sort of in an analytic way, what is wrong with it from the get-go?
The Constitution is a compromise, right? You've got some high-minded ideals and some low-minded practicalities, and you have a compromised document, right? Now, I'm not against compromises in principle. Compromises is how the world moves forward, right? But then you have to look at who was in the room compromising. And the compromise was made between bourgeoisie, liberal Democrats, right? And Democrats with a small d, right? So we're talking about relatively wealthy, relatively young. I mean, these people are in their 30s when they're writing this document. Imagine now being like, whatever Zac Efron and Justin Bieber come up with, we have to listen to that for all time. Right? These are
or Judge Mizell, all of 34 years. That's right. Yeah.
These are 30-year-old rich white dudes compromising
mostly landed,
compromising among themselves about how best to structure a government between their high-minded ideals of liberty and freedom from oppression of kings and their low-minded practicality of wanting to have a slave empire in the Western Hemisphere. And the Constitution reflects that dark compromise where we're trying.
Well, that's what I want to ask you. How so? Because it could be that they, guided by their better angels, had a miracle happen in the hot summer in Philadelphia, or it could be that it's just deeply infected at every provision and word. So tell me how their obvious, benignedness, you go into it in the book, kind of sullies or infects the actual document.
Well, so we start with the grand compromise for the legislature, right? and we have so they come up with a two-house legislature, one the lower house based on representation of people, the upper house based on representation by state. So they give in the Senate equal sovereignty to the states, not the people living there, but the states as entities themselves, so that the small states, Rhode Island, New Jersey, have as many votes as the big states, Virginia, New York. Now, why do they do that? They do that to make the South feel comfortable that they will not get overrun in the national government, because the South is very concerned about preserving their rights to hold people in bondage, right? So that's the Senate. But let's not forget, the House also, a dread compromise where to figure out the population representation of each states, the South wanted to count their enslaved population as part of the numbers to give them more representation in the House. So the 3/5 compromise is a compromise with Northerners were just like, how about you don't count the slaves as 0 people since they have 0 people rights? But no, the South is like, we should count them as 3/5 of people so that we get increased representation in the House. The 3/5 compromise was so the captors of my ancestors could have more political power in the government. And that's just Article 1, Harry. Like that.
All right, well, let's keep going. I mean, almost grotesque. Well, not almost. The whole, it's a chattel system, basically, and the 3/5 in both ways you say. I think no one could deny it. So there's a problem not just with psyche or place or personal morality, but actual provisions. But flash forward, because we are talking about the Constitution's status today. So now it wasn't easy, but those most infamous provisions are gone. Women count fully, African Americans count full, Black people count fully. So very important. That's just Article 1. But I am trying to get at, to the extent it has been sutured and repaired, is it so deep in the actual structure that what remains even after repair reflects these deep flaws?
Yeah, I would say so, right? First of all, even with all of the suturing and the repairing and the amendments and the evolutions, we still have the Senate, right? We still have the Senate, which acts as a bastion of white control. And the reason why the Senate acts as a bastion of white control is because Black people and brown people are not evenly spread out throughout the country, right? Most Black people still live in the states where their ancestors were enslaved. Most Latino people are still near the border states. Most Asian people are still on the coast. Like, we're not spread out evenly through the country. So a system like the Senate, like we have in the Senate, which gives equal suffrage to every state regardless of population, is by its nature going to overrepresent white interests, which are evenly spread out throughout the country, as opposed to Black or brown or minority interests, right? So that's number one.
This is this is in fact why we have the Electoral College, why it can be in several recent elections that the popular vote loser became president, and just the general tyranny we see in the Senate. I forget the numbers every time. It throws me for a loop that something like 30% of the people are able to be a complete roadblock on Senate action. All right, so what of this? Here's the classic defense we get. Government don't want to be too quick to move. We want all kinds of roadblocks on change, cooler heads to prevail. So this fact that does happen to elevate, I would agree, white, sort of rural or middle of the country interests is a feature, not a bug, in the sense that it makes government action harder, and hooray for us in the U.S. Constitution for not being too impetuous. What do you say to that?
Right. So I love the gridlock defense, which is the one that you're making. Right? Like, gridlock is good because we don't want to move too fast, right? But let's look at what happens when we all agree that we should move, right? Let's see how the Constitution lets us move forward when we all agree, i.e. in an amendment process. So I want to take people back to 1865. We fight a war. The good guys win, according to me. I know some people disagree. I think the good guys won. Yeah. We throw up some amendments. One of those amendments is the 15th Amendment, which says that the right to vote cannot be abridged on account of race. Great, wonderful, welcome to the future. Actually, it took them a lot longer to get to women, but for let's just say, welcome to the future. You can now vote regardless of race. What did the Supreme Court do to the 15th Amendment? They took it,
And
they
you're
put
talking
it
about
in
the
a
Voting Rights
drawer,
Act in particular, or well, yeah, go for it.
and they ignored it for 100 years. So like even when we agree that something should change, even when we have an actual constitutional amendment to change something, our system is impotent to actually effectuate that change unless we have people in all three branches of government willing to make that happen. The only reason why something like the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation, the only reason why that had muster was because U.S. Grant was president and he was willing to use the military to enforce it, right? The only reason that the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause had any relevance is because after the Supreme Court finally got around to overturning segregation in 1954, we had John Kennedy willing to send troops to the South to enforce it. And when we look at the 15th Amendment, the reason why, Harry, I often say that the 1965 Voting Rights Act is the most important piece of legislation in American history is that it's the first time, 1965, that we had anything approaching universal suffrage in this country. So if you ask me, and I'm trying to be generous here, if you ask me, America cannot even call itself a democratic republic until 1965. Everything before then involved the legalized restriction of the votes based on race or gender to huge swaths of people. So 1965 is when when you start the clock on the actual American experiment, and you see how that's been going, right? So at every point, even when we try to change and amend the Constitution, it doesn't work in the face of white majorities who don't want to let it work.
You know, what's noteworthy to me, Ellie, about your answer is it went panoramically through every branch. I mean, you know, the Supreme Court takes 100 years to effectuate or recognize the force of the 15th Amendment. The executive, except in rare occasions, is not ready to put national power behind it, and the legislature does as the legislature does. All right, so I see that, and we are in very sort of basic footing, and of course that leads immediately to you know, what's happened what happened after 1965, but really in the last 10 years, and the court's treatment of the Voting Rights Act. Rather than, I'd love to talk to you for hours on this, but rather than delving into too many individual decisions, let's talk more generally. And one more general point that you take very extreme issue with when we're focused on the court, and that I think does go to the heart of the question I'm grappling with of, is it the text or the people or both? And that's the idea of the reigning theory of constitutional interpretation, originalism, which you think, I actually, in the, I remember these very words and are sort of talking it through with TM because he says right out in his speech, I don't believe the meaning of the Constitution was forever fixed at the Philadelphia Convention. And to the extent you take that as a repudiation of originalism, you're very strongly in the same camp. So let's just talk a little bit about your views. And you think originalism is actually defeated by the text itself. And then given the, you know, the main force of originalism as an argument, that is as a kind of undergirding of the you know, what is the law and the Constitution, that we should obey it. What do you substitute for you know, the originalism idea? Now that's like itself a 30-minute answer. So let me just start. What's wrong with originalism, and if not originalism, what ethically, legally, morally binds the American citizens to compliance with the Constitution?
All right, since you've brought this up a couple of times, I'm going to risk. Hopefully, your audience can wants to keep following us here, because I'm going to get.
Am I too pointy headed? We're getting too pointy headed.
I'm going to risk a little wonkishness, right? But
okay.
So my my Civ Pro professor, my civil procedure professor, in law school was Elena Kagan, who now Justice Kagan, who you've heard of her.
And she was actually there in the Justice Marshall year I'm talking about. We were co-clerks for
Okay,
Marshall and
so
Mikva.
she is a clerk for Thurgood Marshall. So I go into her office hours and I'm complaining about something about CivPro. I don't like it very much. And so she quotes Marshall back at me, talking about the importance of the text, the importance of having it written down. And the fact that it's written down is how we can basically stop the bad people. I'm paraphrasing the great Thurgood Marshall through Elena Kagan. But like, this is why, you know, when I'm talking about this book with Professor Jamal Green at Columbia, he says, Ellie, you know, you're a secret textualist.
Well, that's my question.
Right?
And by the way, Elena Kagan says we are all originalists now. So I served that up to you. Go ahead.
Like there is an aspect where I, like Elena Kagan, like you, like Thurgood Marshall, of course you start with the text. The text is all you have to start with, right? It's the question of originalism is not should we or should we not start with the text. The question is, what do we do when the text is ambiguous?
Right.
And so that brings me to my argument that originalism is intellectually bankrupt, because their answer for what to do with textual ambiguity is just ridiculous. The best way that I found to explain this, and I explain this in the book, is by looking at the Eighth Amendment. Right? The Eighth Amendment says very clearly cruel and unusual punishment should be prohibited, right? That's textually, that's what's in the text. Great. Now, what does cruel mean? What does unusual mean? Constitution doesn't say. Text doesn't say. The Founding Fathers, there's no Federalist paper on it. In fact, the Founding Fathers cribbed cruel and unusual from the English Bill of Rights in a century before they were writing, right? So like that phrase, cruel and unusual, we don't know what it means. Now, originalists say that the way to figure out what it means is to go back to the Founding Fathers, go back to the people who wrote it. What did Thomas Jefferson think cruel and unusual meant? What did James Madison think cruel and unusual meant? And that we should apply the Thomas Jefferson and James Madison idea of cruel and unusual to our present day. And I say, are you kidding me? You want me to go ask the slavers what they thought was cruel or unusual? I'm supposed to ask Thomas Jefferson, who was raping his secretary every day, what cruel and unusual means? No, I will not ask Thomas Jefferson. I will not ask James Madison. I do not care what they thought. I will stipulate that their beliefs about cruel and unusual were quite different than mine, that they were barbaric in terms of what they thought was usual and uncruel. I would like a more modern definition, and I will look to any source. I will look to X-Men comic number 17. I will look to Shakespeare. I will look to any other source to find a modern, real, useful definition of cruel and unusual, not those slavers and rapists. So that to me is the real fulcrum. That is the real fight about originalism. It's not about whether or not the text is important or whether or not we should care about the text. Of course the text is important. Of course we should care about the text. It's what do we do with ambiguity? And the originalist answer for what we do with ambiguity is morally bankrupt.
Okay. And by the way, I do want to say, as I read your book, and it's like Justice Marshall, you know, you may be seen when you go on MSNBC as a, you know, wild dude with a great haircut, but you're sort of conservative among radicals, as was Marshall, right? He was always saying, you know, I believe in the law, we should fight this way. And you know, I think that's basically there with you. As we're in our pointy-headed, well, I was going to say our pointy-headed detour, but really maybe the entire podcast is this. I just want to put in a word for another view of originalism that the listeners can think about, because it's mine, and I would say, what's the answer to cruel and unusual? You're right. It's not those guys. They were cropping ears and other stuff. It's they wrote this principle, and now it's to us to interpret that principle according to our best moral understanding in 2022. But let's set that to the side. Well, I'll say one more thing about originalism, which, as then Professor Kagan was telling you, it does, you know, give a strong account of why the Constitution is law and higher law in a way that maybe other, you know, more protean theories wouldn't. I do want to touch on, man, it's such an interesting book, Ellie. I want to stay general, except I wanted to touch on just a couple areas, and they are really less about this. is it the text? Is it the people? What's going on? I just want to, locate where we are in the world and in history, what's happening, and especially with this current court. So you talk a fair bit about religious freedom. And, so just last week, you had somebody from the military say, I don't want to get a vaccine and make it a kind of a religious claim. Why? Because COVID has become a civic religion. I'm quoting from the brief, and cloaking it in some kind of religious, I guess, establishment clause claim. And 3 justices on record, 99.5% of these things are denied under law. 3 justices said they would have granted the claim. I wonder if you can just speak about where we're going and where we've gone in the last few years on so-called free exercise, and whether you think it's a sort of a pruning at the edges or a real sort of restructuring of basically social life in this country.
The First Amendment, which is what we're talking about, the First Amendment, which is where we locate the freedom of religion, the freedom from establishment of religion, and the freedom to kind of practice pray to your own God in the privacy of your own mind, where we locate all of those rights, is supposed to be a shield, right? It's supposed to protect us from the government coming into our homes, coming into our, into our private areas, and imposing itself on us. It's supposed to be a shield. What the right wing has done is change it into a sword. So now it's this thing that they can use, that they feel empowered to go use and bash other people for their beliefs, to stop other people from practicing whatever they want to do or from not practicing at all. And that is the tension between the freedom of religion, the free exercise of religion, and the freedom from establishment of religion. We say as a country that everybody should be allowed to worship or pray or do however in accordance to their God, whoever that God is, right? That is the grant of free exercise in this country. But we also say that we will not, as a nation, establish one religious supremacy over all others, that we will not establish one religious doctrine all over all others, and that we will not establish one religious code of morality to apply to everybody else, right? That is our protection from religion. And it's that part that the right wing is just like, we don't care about that anymore. And so
and why, by the way, I don't want to get too psychological, but why is this so central to the right-wing agenda as you see it?
It's how they justify their bigotry, right? It's how all these culture war issues that actually have nothing to do with religion, that it's just how they was raised kind of thing. All these culture war issues, they can extend their bigotry beyond the privacy of their own home by using the First Amendment against the LGBTQ community. That's where it all comes from. So when you see, when you're one of these MAGA people and you see 2 men having dinner together in a restaurant and it makes you feel uncomfortable, instead of like dealing with that, like looking to yourself to like evolve a bit, you go and you run to the First Amendment and you say that your religious freedom is being impacted by these 2 people having dinner together in your restaurant. How dare they? And so then you use look. This is the same thing that happened to Black people during before the Civil Rights era, right? Where people were making these arguments, that Black people eating in their restaurant was a violation of their own rights. It's not. I'm just getting some food. Same with the LGBTQ community, but but these people are using the First Amendment against them. It's really dangerous. And in terms to really answer the broadness of your question of where we're going. Yeah, I don't think your kind of baseline Democratic voter or liberal understands just how much we've lost this argument, right? So in Fulton, in a recent case last year, Fulton County v. City of Philadelphia, it was a big gay adoption case, and was whether or not the City of Philadelphia had to use an anti-gay religious organization to place foster kids. City of Philadelphia said, no, they won't place foster kids with gay families. The Supreme Court, 9-0, said actually that's fine. That actually using state funds to fund a religious organization which will not place foster kids with gay families because of their religious beliefs, that was an acceptable use of state funds. And in fact, the city was compelled to use those funds to fund that bigoted religious organization. That's where 9-0. That's where we are. Now, that 9-0 decision was not 9-0. Everybody thought it was great. I mean, there was a little bit of horse trading.
Yeah.
I would argue that Sotomayor, Kagan, and Breyer voted with the majority to basically keep them from going even further. So the 9-0 opinion was actually a Roberts opinion that only Roberts agreed with the liberals and the conservatives kind of joining Roberts to make sure that the other side didn't get everything that it wanted. So it's not 9-0 in this kind of like everybody was on the same page decision, but still it's 9-0 in the sense that we are living in a world where some religious bigotry is going to be some religious bigotry against the LGBTQ community is going to be accepted as legitimate state action. Sorry about the dog.
That's okay. No, it's a really good point. And on a whole nother topic is the strategic position of the three progressives. So we had a case a couple years ago involving a humongous cross, which they embraced a kind of little harm theory of
Trinity Lutheran.
it in. I just want to point out that, when these things happen, they involve the bake shop case, this case, a counter-majoritarian principles. It's just as you say, we're talking about instances where the political entity has said, we don't want this kind of discrimination. You can't be in our playground if you do it. And then they run to the courts. That's what the courts are there for, and to get a ruling that they're getting with increasing alacrity and assurance that, actually, yes, we can. All right, a little bit. I mean, it feels like your main brief, maybe in the current book, it has to do with the Fourth Amendment, and that would be a whole nother episode. But I wanted to zero in particular. You have kind of three cases where you think the court went badly awry in the Fourth Amendment area, and in ways that kind of perpetuates the racist weaknesses of the original Constitution. Terry v. Ohio is one, super interesting, but let's set it to the side. And the second one is Graham versus Connor. Can you talk about that and why you think this? I hope it's interesting for listeners. Like, here are little cases you never heard about. They're really changing life on the streets and things we've seen in the last few years, affecting officer behavior and the like. What's your beef with Graham v. Connor?
Right. So Graham v. Connor is the case that establishes what the appropriate use of police force is, and thus police deadly force. All right. This came out in the 80s. This is a Rehnquist decision, and what it was there was a guy who basically got roughed up by the cops when he shouldn't have. I can read the book. I go into the whole story, but he basically got beat up by the cops. And Rehnquist, and he argued that his the man Graham argued that his beating by the cop was a violation of his 14th Amendment rights, that it was a racially discriminatory beating, that they wouldn't have beaten a white man in the same situation. Well, Rehnquist ignored that.
And I think also, by the way, just a substantive due process, nobody should be able to get, it wasn't only a racial claim, but just like, man, you beat the tar out of me, and that's just not in this country. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you, Harry. It wasn't just equal protection. It was also the due process claim, right? So Rehnquist ignores that, just literally throws that out, converts his 14th Amendment claim into a Fourth Amendment claim of unreasonable search and seizure, the beating of him being the seizure, and says, so again, Graham did not ask for a Fourth Amendment ruling. Rehnquist decided to give him a Fourth Amendment ruling, and then, of course, Rehnquist decided to rule poorly and determined that for a search or a seizure to be unreasonable according to the Fourth Amendment, it's got to be unreasonable in the eyes of another officer at the scene. So who gets to decide reasonable? The other cops. Well, that's weird, right? Like, why? Like, if I'm trying to think about how I'm going to constrain the cops, why would I let other cops be the ones to decide what is restraint and what is constraint and what is allowed and what shouldn't be allowed, right? Why would I allow the foxes to determine what kind of security I need at the hen house? That's just ridiculous to me, right? So kind of subtly, one of the more radical things I do say in the book, and it's only, I mean, tagged as for being radical for the Constitution is not good. That's not a radical position, folks.
No.
But something that
there
is.
aren't any. It's really your hair, Ellie. That's all. Yeah.
But something that is my solution to Graham v. Connor, right? So like if the Rehnquist is telling me, and the courts now have adopted, that we have to look at reasonableness from the perspective of an officer on the scene, I say, what if we made it an objective standard? A truly objective standard, so that, yes, in hindsight, it has to look reasonable. In slow-mo, it has to look reasonable, right? I understand these are quick situations, but it should be objectively provable that your use of force, and especially your use of deadly force, was reasonable. So, for instance, if you think that the suspect has a gun and you shoot them, the suspect had better have a gun. If you are wrong, if the suspect didn't have a gun, if he had a wallet or a cell phone or a hair pick, and you shoot him to death, then guess what? Strict liability, you go to jail. Like,
well, that's
that
a whole
would
other
be
thing is qualified immunity.
So let me just finish the point.
No,
here,
please.
right?
I'm sorry.
So the pushback that I get from that is cops saying, well, that kind of standard, that would make us hesitate in these bang bang situations. And I'm like, yes, it would make you hesitate. And what we should want is for cops to hesitate before using deadly force.
All right, very good. But so sticking with Graham v. Connor, you've heard the things on the other side. It's, it takes an officer to appreciate what it's like out there, and the sort of fever and the hair trigger decisions. I will say it's kind of ironic because the law, the federal law, says it's a crime to act unreasonably. I worked on the Ronnie King case, and the lead prosecutor there, fantastic prosecutor named Steve Clymer, in his closing argument, he gets down on his back, crab-like, as Rodney King is, and says, here's the tape, here's what happens. You, jury, you need to decide, is this reasonable? Is this how you want cops to behave in this country? And, it's just a different vision. I understand the Graham v. Connor decision, but it does... it's a moral question. What do we? Who should be deciding reasonableness? All right.
I would argue, just to close that point. Like I would argue that the cops have lost their privilege they have lost the assumption of acting in good faith. It's not the phrase is not one bad apple spoils. The phrase is not one bad apple. If you get it in the bunch, don't worry about it. Just eat it because most of them are good apples. The phrase is one bad apple spoils the bunch. It means you throw the whole bunch out if you think that there's a bad apple in there because you don't know where the bad apple is until you bite into it. So
I remember the Jackson 5 song anyway is a little bit different, but I take your point.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. But yeah, no, the issue is that if cops had shown that they were able to handle the power and responsibility they have in a less violent way, I could be in a world where I agree with Graham v. Connor. But we've had, 40 years of evidence that standard is not working.
All right. Now, as you say, Graham v. Connor is under the 14th Amendment. There is a view, maybe you would consider it a Panglossian view of the Constitution, that the flaws were basically corrected in the post-Civil War amendments, 13 through 15. And I think at least a very big part of your thesis is this is how you identify the sort of stress point of the constitutional debate between liberals and conservatives. That is, you say, I'll just quote from you, the real debate on the Supreme Court is the debate over whether or not the post-Civil War amendments worked to redeem the document. Conservatives fundamentally act as though they did not. They act as if the post-Civil War amendments were mere updates to the original slave document, and we still have a white supremacist constitution. I'd like to ask you to sort of elaborate on that, both as a matter, are we talking text? Are we talking psyche? Are we talking political culture? What is it if that's the real sort of hot, epicenter of the debate that, at least by numbers, conservatives are thumping liberals on? what's the source of the view, or just elaborate on the content of the view, I guess.
Conservatives, regardless of what they call themselves, like after the Civil War, they call themselves Democrats. Today, they call themselves Republicans. I don't care what they call themselves. Conservatives, the conservative party, the conservative mentality, from the inception of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, have tried to limit their effectiveness. They've tried to cable what those amendments can do. The very first case that we had about one of those amendments was the Slaughterhouse Cases. It addressed the 14th Amendment, and it was white people arguing that they had economic rights under the 13th and 14th Amendments that were being denied by large corporate monopolies. And right out of the gate, the conservatives on the Supreme Court said, nope, we're not going to hear that. The 13th Amendment is only for black people. They called it the slave race at the time, but okay. 13th Amendment is only for black people. The 14th Amendment doesn't confer economic rights. Get out of my courtroom. So right at the jump, we have conservatives limiting the scope of the 13th and 14th Amendment in ways that potentially the people who wrote it did not think that it should be limited. All right. Conversely, liberals generally try to expand the scope of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, and eventually the 19th Amendments, so that it can infect all aspects of our society. The difference between me and a true black radical, a true black nationalist, is that I think the 14th Amendment does all the things.
Yeah.
I don't think that we need a new constitutional convention. I don't think that we need a new nation. I don't think that we need a new separate homeland for black people, because I've got the 14th Amendment. And if y'all would just let it work and let it do what it was meant to do, it solves so many of the problems. The equal protection of the law shall not be abridged. It says it right there. Just give me equal protection, thank you very much. Due process of law. Give me due process, thank you very much. And then I got no problems, Jules. Like that's where I kind of start. Like when people say like, oh, originalism, it's such a good bumper sticker phrase. Yeah, my bumper sticker phrase is, I'm a 14th Amendmentist ologist, whatever, right? Like everything, to me,
we can stick that on one bumper sticker, I think. Yeah.
Right? To me, the Constitution is the 14th Amendment and a bunch of suggestions. Like, because if your law or statute or ordinance cannot pass muster with the 14th Amendment, cannot pass the muster of equal protection and due process, then your law is suspect.
The book is Allow Me To Retort, a black guy's guide to the Constitution by the inimitable Elie Mystal. Thank you so much for being here. That's available wherever books are sold, but get it fast because it's selling fast. Ellie, really enjoyed this conversation and really grateful for your time in talking through the book, and even some of the issues that the book sets up that went a little farther afield, but I really enjoyed.
Thank you so much, Harry.